Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Dr. Ayaz Afsa, and our topic today is approaches to qualitative data analysis. Qualitative data analysis involves organizing, accounting for, and explaining the data. In short, making sense of data in terms of the participants' definitions of the situation, noting patterns, themes, categories, and regularities. In this lecture, I will discuss several forms of qualitative data analysis. There is no one single or correct way to analyze and present qualitative data. How one does it should abide by the issue of fitness for purpose. Further, qualitative data analysis, as we shall see here, is often heavy on interpretation, and one has to note that there are frequently multiple interpretations to be made of qualitative data. That is their glory and their headache. In abiding by the principle of fitness for purpose, the researcher must be clear what he or she wants the data analysis to do, as this will determine the kind of analysis that is undertaken. The researcher can set out, for example, to describe, to portray, to summarize, to interpret, to discover patterns, to generate themes, to understand individuals and idiographic features, to understand groups and nomothetic features, for example, frequencies, norms, patterns, laws, to raise issues to prove or demonstrate, to explain and seek causality, and to explore, to test, to discover commonalities, differences, and similarities, to examine the application and operation of the same issues in different contexts. The significance of deciding the purpose is that it will determine the kind of analysis performed on the data. This in turn will influence the way in which the analysis is written up. The data analysis will also be influenced by the kind of qualitative study that is being undertaken. For example, a biography and a case study may be most suitably written as descriptive narrative, often chronologically, with issues raised throughout. An ethnography may be written as narrative or stories with issues raised, but not necessarily conforming to a chronology of events, and including description, analysis, interpretation, and explanation of the key features of a group or culture. A grounded theory and content analysis will proceed through a systematic series of analysis, including coding and categorization, until theory emerges that explains the phenomena being studied or which can be used for predictive purposes. The analysis will also be influenced by the number of data sets and people from whom data have been collected. Qualitative data often focus on smaller numbers of people than quantitative data, yet the data tend to be detailed and rich. Researchers will need to decide, for example, whether to present data individual by individual, and then, if desired, to amalgamate key issues emerging across the individuals, or whether to proceed by working within a largely predetermined analytical frame of issues that crosses the individual or the individuals concerned. Some qualitative studies, for example, Bowl 1990 or Bow 1992, deliberately focus on individuals and the responses of significant players in a particular scenario, often quoting verbatim responses in the final account. Others are content to summarize issues without necessarily identifying exactly from whom the specific data were derived. Later on, here we'll discuss methods to be used with respect to people and issues. Some studies include a lot of verbatim conversations. Others use fewer verbatim data. Some researchers feel that it is important to keep the flavor of the original data. So they report direct phrases and sentences, not only because they are often more illuminative and direct than the researchers' own words, but also because they feel that it is important to be faithful to the exact words used. Indeed, as reported in the example later, direct conversations can be immensely rich in data and detail. Bowl and Bow use a lot of verbatim data, not least because those whom they interviewed were powerful people and justice needed to be done to the exact words they used. By contrast, Wolfold, 2001, commenting on the fetish of transcription, admits that he rarely fully transcribed more than a few interviews for any of his research studies, not least because of the time that it took for transcription. At a practical level, qualitative research rapidly amasses huge amounts of data, and early analysis reduces the problem of data overload, by selecting out significant features for future focus. Miles and Huberman, 1984, suggests that careful data display is an important element of data reduction and selection. Progressive focusing, according to Pollitt and Hamilton, 1976, starts with the researcher taking a wide-angle lens to gather data, and then by sifting, sorting, reviewing, and reflecting on them, the salient features of the situation emerge. These are then used as the agenda for subsequent focusing. The process is akin to funneling from the wide to the narrow. At a theoretical level, a major feature of qualitative research is that analysis often begins early on in the data collection process so that theory generation can be undertaken. Researchers should set out the main outlines of the phenomena that are under investigation. They should then assemble blocks or groups of data, putting them together to make a coherent whole. Then they should painstakingly take apart their field nodes, matching, contrasting, aggregating, comparing, and ordering notes made. The intention is to move from description to explanation and theory generation. I outline several examples of data analysis and presentation in this session. The first of these illustrates simple summary and clear tabulated data presentation and commentary. It derives from a doctorate thesis. By Chinese children learning English, an example of analyzing and presenting interview data was the topic the title of the thesis. The interview data are presented question by question in this thesis. In what follows, where the data for respondents in each age phase are similar, they are grouped into a single set of responses by row. Where there are dissimilar responses, they are kept separate. The left-hand column in each table indicates the number of the respondents, 1 to 12, and the level which the respondent taught, for example, P1, F3, etc. So, for example, 1 to 3, P1 means the responses of respondents 1 to 3 who taught P1 classes. The right-hand column indicates the responses. In many cases, it can be seen that respondents all gave similar responses in terms of the actual items mentioned and the coverage of items specified. A brief summary comment is provided after each table. The data here derive from a doctorate thesis concerning the problems that school children experience in learning English in China. The data set reproduced is incomplete and has been selected for illustrative purposes only. Note that the data are not verbatim but have already been summarized by the researcher. That is, what is presented here is not the first stage of the data analysis, as the first stage would be transcription. The coding is as follows. P1 to P6 means primary forms 1 to 6, where P1 is year 1 and P2 year 2. F1 to F5 represents secondary forms from 1 to 5, where F1 means form 1, first year of secondary school, and F2 form 2, second year of secondary school. The question on the questionnaire was asked, and that is question number 6, the effectiveness of English teaching, and that is 1 to 3 in the right hand column, as I explained, is the year the respondents teach, and P1 is the primary school, and the data collected from these is presented and summarized in the right hand column. So 1 to 3 primary year 1 respondents comments: students neither understand written or spoken English, nor were they able to speak or write very well. Although students started learning English at a very young age, their standard was still very low, as they could not really understand or use English. You know, one purpose of data you have collected through the questionnaire, it is a mass, a huge data, and you need to reduce it, the reduction process, and this is one way of presenting that data. Where there are commonalities or similarities, they are put into one group. As in this example, primary year 1 respondents 1 to 3 said that the summary is presented in the right hand column. In the same way, in second example, it is year 4 to 6, and it is P6 primary level year 6 students, and what the respondents, and in this case the respondents are the teachers, what did they say? Their comments have been summarized, mean the data has been reducted here. Students could not speak, read or write English well. Students had a low standard as they could not read, write or speak English. They used memorization to learn and thus their English knowledge was very superficial and confined to limited vocabulary. That is respondent number 4, 5 and 6, teaching year 6. Okay, here 7 to 9, respondents number 7 to 9, which teach, you see, F for the secondary school, year 3. And their comments have been summarized in the right hand column. On the whole, student standard was low. English teaching and learning was not very successful. Even with poor knowledge of English, students will manage to get jobs. This was not an international city. English was not really that important, even if students did not learn well. And respondent number 10, who teaches secondary year 5, English teaching and learning were not very effective, as students were not working hard and they resorted to memorization to learn English. However, students managed to get into universities. Students have learned at least some basic knowledge about English. And respondent number 11, that is 10, 11 and 12, means that their responses have been recording. They are not put into one group as in the previous examples. It was effective to some extent, as some students became English teachers themselves, having finishing their university education. So that was the information that was gathered through the questionnaire, and after coding and transcribing the questionnaire, their answers have been summarized and put into categories, and that is what analysis means, and there are more examples follow. This was about the tabulating data. The numbers preceding each letter in the left-hand column refer to the number ascribed to the teacher, already explained. There were 12 teachers in all, 6 from primary and 6 from secondary schools. Well, English teaching and learning at school have not really achieved their intended purposes. Students are poor at understanding written or spoken English, speaking, reading, listening and writing. This limits their abilities regardless of the number of years of learning English. Low-level memorization model leads to superficial learning. Teaching and learning are poor. Students can enter university even though their standard is poor, as there are many universities to take students. Students do not require English to gain employment. After presenting your data in a table, in a tabular form, you need to add a comment. And what were those comments added? The primary English teachers had a wide range of views than the secondary teachers. There was greater unanimity between the primary teachers in comparison with the secondary teachers. All the Form 3 secondary teachers were unanimous in their comments, and all the Form 5 secondary teachers had different views. So box number 2, which is here, it follows the next slide, indicates that the strengths of English teaching were that students start to learn English very young, and schools had autonomy over the design of syllabuses. And the weaknesses in English teaching were that insufficient emphasis was placed on understanding, students were too young to learn English, and syllabuses were unrealistic in their demands, being too rich, leading teachers to a spoon-feeding mentality in their teaching. Also, undue pressure was put on teachers and students because of the demands of the syllabus, and English had to compete with other languages for curriculum space. Hence, students did not learn well despite years of learning English. So that is a tabulating data, the strengths and weaknesses of English presented in form of this table, and P1 respondent number 1, the primary, and comments are recorded in front of it, and respondent number 2 to 6 teaching primary 6, and respondent number 7 to 9 teach secondary school year 3, and 10 to 12 year 5. And after tabulating data, the comments were added. Apart from one primary teacher, the other 11 teachers drawn from both primary and secondary schools were unanimous in the comments they gave. It was clear that high class size between 30 to 50 students, rising sometimes to 60, and tight syllabuses exerted a significant impact on teaching methods and restrictions of class activities because of control issues. And that is presented in the next box, that was about the teaching methods. In the same way, in the column respondents and their comments summarized in the right hand column. The nature of this influence is to adopt largely didactic and grammar translation methods with little extent recourse to using or thinking in English. Teaching utilized some group activity, but this was very limited. Teachers used Chinese to explain English. About the teaching methods, all the teachers here were unanimous in their comments, which fell mainly into two sets of points. Students contributed significantly to their own success or failure in learning English, and that is presented in the table form. Question number 11, student related facts. 1 to 3, primary, year 1, teacher response: students were shy and were afraid of losing face when they made mistakes in front of the class. A student basically had no interest in learning anything, especially a foreign language. Students had too many subjects to learn, and learning English was too bookish. There were too many other distractions, such as surfing the internet or going out with friends. So the summary of the table is that the students were shy, afraid of making mistakes and of losing face, and had little interest in learning at all, let alone English. They were overloaded with other subjects, a situation exacerbated by their poor time management. They had negative attitudes to the bookish nature of learning English and its unrelatedness to other curriculum subjects, had too many other directions, and had limited abilities in English. They had little incentive to learn, as they could repeat courses, gave little priority to English, had poor foundations for learning English, and had limited motivation or positive foundations or positive attitudes. Well, they gave little priority to English, had poor foundations for learning English, and had limited motivation or positive attitudes to learning English. They were given limited direction in their learning and had limited incentive to learn English well, as universities required only a low standard of English. After tabulating the data, the comments added. There was a great variety of comments here. There were degrees of agreement. The teachers of the younger primary children agreed with each other. The teachers of the older primary children agreed with each other, and the teachers of the older secondary children agreed with each other. The teachers of the younger secondary children raised different points from each other. However, the four groups of teachers, younger primary, older primary, younger secondary, and older secondary raise different points from each other. The issue that emerge from the interview data are striking in several ways. What characterizes the data is the widespread agreement of the respondents on the issues. For example, there was absolute unanimity in the responses to questions 9 and 12. There was very considerable, though not absolute, unanimity on question 11. In addition to the unanimity already observed, there was additional unanimity among the primary teachers in respect of question 11. In addition to the considerable, though not absolute unanimity already observed, there was much unanimity among the primary teachers concerning question number 6. Such a degree of unanimity gives considerable power to the results, even though, because of the sampling used, they cannot be said to be representative of the wider population. However, the sample of experienced teachers was deliberately selected to provide an informed overview of the key issues to be faced. It must be remembered that though the unanimity is useful, the main purpose of the interview data was to identify key issues regardless of unanimity, convergence, or frequency of mention. That the respondents articulated similar issues, however, signals that these may be important elements. Further, the issues themselves are seen to lie in a huge diversity of fields, such that there is no single or simplistic set of problems or solutions. Hence, to complement the considerable unanimity of voice is a similar consensus in identifying the scope of the problem, yet the range of the problem is vast. Both singly and together, the issue of English language teaching, learning, and achievement in Macau are complex. The messages are clear in respect of Form 5 students and their English teaching and learning. First, English performance is weak in all aspects: reading, writing, speaking, and listening, but it is particularly weak in speaking and writing. Second, local cultural factors exert an influence on learning English. Students do not wish to lose face in public, and the Chinese emphasis on gaining and maintaining face is powerful. Students are shy and afraid of making mistakes. The pressure of examination success is universal and severe. The local culture is not English, it is Chinese, and if anything else, is Portuguese rather than English. Although this latter is very limited, there is little need for people to speak or use English at present. In some quarters, knowledge of English culture is seen to be an important element in learning English. This was refuted by the teachers in this sample. The third main message is that English is seen instrumentally, but this message has to be qualified, as many students gain employment and university entrance even though their English is weak. The fact of English being an international language has limited effect on student motivation or achievement. Finally, poor teaching and learning are significant contributors to poor performance in several areas. For example, there is great emphasis on drill, rote learning, and memorization. There is a predominance of passive rather than active learning, with teaching as the delivery of facts rather than the promotion of learning and understanding. Traditional didactic methods are used. There is reliance on a very limited range of teaching and learning styles. The limited subject and pedagogical knowledge of English teachers are compounded by the lack of adequate initial and post-initial teacher education. Frequently, the careful laying of foundations of English teaching and learning is absent. Students use so much Chinese during English lessons that they have little chance to think in English. They translate rather than think in English. From the interview data, it can be seen that the size of the problems and issues to be faced in English language teaching and learning is vast. In this example, tables are carefully laid to draw together similar sets of responses. The tables enable the reader to see at a glance where similarities and differences lie between the two groups of respondents. Note also that after each table there is a summary of the main points to which the researcher wishes to draw the student's attention, and that these comprise both substantive and overall comments, for example on the topic in hand and on the similarities and differences between the groups of respondents respectively. Finally, note that an overall summary of key messages has been provided at the end of all the tables and their commentaries. This is a very abridged and selective example, and justice has not been done to the whole of the data that the original researcher used. Nevertheless, the point is clearly illustrated here that summarizing and presenting data in tabular form can address the twin issues of qualitative research, that is data reduction through careful data display and commentary. Well, there are 5 ways of organizing and presenting data analysis. Here I will present 5 ways of organizing and presenting analysis as follows. The first 2 methods are by people, and the next 2 methods are by issue, and then final method is by instrument. So one can observe in the example of teaching English in Macau that the data have been organized and presented by respondents in response to particular issues. Indeed, where the respondents said the same, they have been organized by groups of respondents in relation to a given issue. The groups of respondents were also organized by their membership of different strata in a stratified sample. Teachers of younger primary children, older primary children, younger secondary children, and older secondary children. This is only one way of organizing a qualitative data analysis, by groups. The advantage of this method is that it automatically groups the data and enables themes, patterns, and similar to be seen at a glance. While this is a useful method for summarizing similar responses, the collective responses of an individual participant are dispersed across many categories and groups of people, and the integrity and coherence of the individual respondent risks being lost to a collective summary. Further, this method is often used in relation to a single instrument approach. Otherwise, it becomes unwieldy. For example, trying to put together the data derived from qualitative questionnaires, interviews, and observations could be very cumbersome in this approach. So researchers may find it helpful to use this approach instrument by instrument. A second way of organizing the data analysis is by individuals. Here the total responses of a single participant are presented, and then the analysis moves on to the next individual. This preserves the coherence and integrity of the individual response and enables a whole picture of that person to be presented, which may be important for the researcher. However, this integrity has its price, in that unless the researcher is interested only in individual responses, it often requires him or her then to put together the issues arising across the individuals in order to look for themes, shared responses, patterns of response, agreement and disagreement, to compare individuals and issues that each of them has raised, that is to summarize the data. While approaches that are concerned with people strive to be faithful to those involved in terms of the completeness of the picture of them qua people, unless case study approaches are deemed to be driving the research, they are usually accompanied by a second round of analysis, which is of the issues that arise from the people, and it is to the matter of issues that I turn now. A third way of organizing data is to present all the data that are relevant to a particular issue. This is the method that was used in the example of Chinese students learning English presented in the beginning. While it is economical in making comparisons across respondents, the issue of data reduction through careful data display, I mentioned earlier, again the wholeness, coherence and integrity of each individual respondent risks being lost. The derivation of the issue for which data are gathered needs to be clarified. For example, it could be that the issue has been decided preordinately, means in advance of the data collection. Then all the relevant data for that issue are simply collected together into the single basket, the issue in question. While this is an economical approach to handling, summarizing and presenting data, it raises three main concerns. The integrity and wholeness of each individual can be lost, such that comparison across the whole picture from each individual is almost impossible. The data can become decontextualized. This may occur in two ways. First, in terms of their place in the emerging sequence and content of the interview or the questionnaire. Some data may require an understanding of what preceded a particular comment or set of comments. And second, in terms of the overall picture of the relatedness of the issue, as this approach can fragment the data into relatively discrete chunks, thereby losing their interconnectedness. Having had its framework and areas of interest already decided preordinately, the analysis may be unresponsive to additional relevant factors that could emerge responsively in the data. It is akin to lowering a magnet on data. The magnet picks up relevant data for the issue in question, but it also leaves behind data not deemed relevant, and these risk being lost. The researcher there has to troll through the residual data to see if there are other important issues that have emerged that have not been caught in the preordinate selection of categories and issues for attention. The researcher therefore has to be mindful of the strengths and weaknesses not only of preordinate categorization and by implication including responsive categorization, but also the researcher must decide whether it is or is not important to consider the whole set of responses of an individual, that is to decide whether the data analysis is driven by people, respondents, or by issues. A fourth method of organizing the analysis is by research question. This is a very useful way of organizing data, as it draws together all the relevant data for the exact issue of concern to the researcher and preserves the coherence of the material. It returns the reader to the driving concerns of the research, thereby closing the loop on the research questions that typically were raised in the early part of an inquiry. In this approach, all the relevant data from various data streams, interviews, observation questionnaires are collated to provide a collective answer to a research question. There is usually a degree of systematization here, in that, for example, the numerical data for a particular research question will be presented, followed by the qualitative data or vice versa. This enables patterns, relationships, comparisons, and qualifications across data types to be explored conveniently and clearly. A fifth method of organizing the data is by instrument. Typically, this approach is often used in conjunction with another approach, for example, by issue or by people. Here, the results of each instrument are presented. For example, all the interview data are presented and organized, and then all the data from questionnaires are presented, followed by all the documentary data and field notes, and so on. While this approach retains fidelity to the coherence of the instrument and enables the reader to see clearly which data derive from which instrument, one has to observe that the instrument is often only a means to an end, and that further analysis will be required to analyze the content of the responses by issue and by people. Hence, if it is important to know from which instrument the data are derived, then this is a useful method. However, if that is not important, then this could be adding an unnecessary level of analysis to the data. Further, connections between data could be lost if the data are presented instrument by instrument rather than across instruments. In analyzing qualitative data, a major tension may arise from using contrasting, holistic, and fragmentary or atomistic modes of analysis. The example of teaching English in Macau is clearly atomistic, breaking down the analysis into smaller sections and units. It could be argued that this violates the wholeness of the respondent's evidence, and there is some truth to this, though one has to ask whether this is a problem or not. Sectionalizing and fragmenting the analysis can make for easy reading. On the other hand, holistic approaches to qualitative data presentation will want to catch the wholeness of individuals and groups, and this may lead to a more narrative, almost case study a story style of reporting, with issues emerging as they arise during the narrative. Neither approach is better than the other. Researchers need to decide how to present data with respect to their aims and intended readership. Data analysis can be very systematic. Becker and Gear indicate how this might proceed. It could be comparing different groups simultaneously and over time, matching the responses given in interviews to observed behavior, analyzing deviant and negative cases, calculating frequencies of occurrences and responses, assembling and providing sufficient data that keeps separate raw data from analysis. In qualitative data, the analysis here is almost inevitably interpretive. Hence, the data analysis is less a completely accurate representation, but more of a reflexive, reactive interaction between the researcher and the decontextualized data that are already interpretations of a social encounter. Indeed, reflexivity is an important feature of qualitative data analysis. The issue here is that the researcher brings to the data his or her own preconceptions, interests, biases, preferences, biography, background, and agenda. As Walford 2001 writes, all research is researching yourself. In particular, it means that the researcher may be selective in his or her focus, or that the research may be influenced by the subjective features of the researcher. Lincoln and Guba suggest that these can include data overload, means humans may be unable to handle large amounts of data. First impressions. Early data analysis may affect later data collection and analysis. Availability of people, for example, how representative these are, and how to know if missing people and data might be important. Information availability. Easily accessible information may receive greater attention than hard to obtain data. Positive instances. A researcher may overemphasize confirming data and underemphasize disconfirming data. Internal consistency. The unusual, unexpected, or novel way be undertreated. Uneven reliability. The researcher may overlook the fact that some sources are more reliable or unreliable than others. Missing data. That issues for which there is incomplete data may be overlooked or neglected. A revision of hypotheses. Researchers may overreact or underreact to new data. Confidence in judgment. Researchers may have greater confidence in their final judgment than is tenable. Co-occurrence may be mistaken for association. Inconsistency. Subsequent analyses of the same data may yield different results. The issue here is that great caution and self-awareness must be exercised by the researcher in conducting a qualitative analysis, for the analysis and the findings may say more about the researcher than about the data. For example, it is the researcher who sets the codes and categories for analysis, be they preordinate or responsive, means whether they are decided in advance or in response to data analysis. It is the researcher's agenda that drives the research and the researcher who chooses the methodology. As the researcher analyzes data, he or she will have ideas, insights, comments, reflections to make on data. These can be noted down in memos, and indeed these can become data themselves in the process of reflexivity. Glaser and Robson argue that memos are not data in themselves but have the process of data analysis. This is debatable. If reflexivity is part of the data analysis process, then memos may become legitimate secondary data in the process or journey of data analysis. Many computer packages for qualitative data analysis have a facility not only for the researcher to write a memo, but also to attach it to a particular piece of datum. There is no single nature or format of a memo. It can include subjective thoughts about the data with ideas, theories, reflections, comments, opinions, personal responses, suggestions for future and new lines of research, reminders, observations, evaluations, critiques, judgments, conclusions, explanations, considerations, implications, speculations, predictions, hunches, theories, connections, relationships between codes and categories, insights, and so on and so forth. Memos can be reflections on the past, present, and future, thereby beginning to examine the issue of causality. There is no required minimum or maximum length. The memos should be dated not only for a case of reference, but also for marking of the development of the researcher as well as of the research. Memos are an important part of the self-conscious reflection on the data and have considerable potential to inform the data collection, analysis, and theorizing. They should be written whenever they strike the researcher as important during and after analysis. They can be written anytime. Indeed, some researchers deliberately carry a pen and paper with them whenever they go, so that ideas that occur can be written down before they are forgotten. The great tension in data analysis is between maintaining a sense of the holism of the data, the text, and the tendency for analysis to atomize and fragment the data, to separate them into constituent elements, thereby losing the synergy of the whole, and often the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So there are several stages in analysis, for example, generating natural units of meaning, classifying, categorizing, and ordering these units of meaning, structuring narratives to describe the contents, interpreting the data. These are comparatively generalized stages. Miles and Haberman suggest 12 tactics actually for generating meaning from transcribed data. Counting frequencies of occurrence of ideas, themes, pieces of data, and words, noting patterns and themes which may stem from repeated themes and causes or explanations or constructs, seeing plausibility, trying to make good sense of data using informed intuition to reach a conclusion, clustering, setting items into categories, types, behaviors, and classifications, making metaphors, using figurative and connotative language rather than literal and denotative language, bringing data to life, thereby reducing data, making patterns, decentering the data, and connecting data with theory, splitting variables to elaborate, differentiate, and unpack ideas, that is, to move away from the drive towards integration and the blurring of data, subsuming particulars into the general, a move towards clarifying key concepts, factoring, bringing a large number of variables under a smaller number of unobserved hypothetical variables, identifying and noting relations between variables, finding intervening variables, looking for other variables that appear to be getting in the way of accounting for what one would expect to be strong relationship between variables, building a logical claim of evidence, noting causality, and making inference. Making conceptual theoretical coherence means moving from metaphors to constructs to theories to explain the phenomena. This progression, though perhaps positivist in its tone, is a useful way of moving from the specific to the general in data analysis. Running through the suggestions from Myers and Huberman is the importance that they attach to coding of data, partially as a way of reducing what is typically data overload from qualitative data. Myers and Huberman suggest that analysis through coding can be performed both within sites and across sites, enabling causal chains, networks, and matrices to be established. All of these addressing what they see as the major issue of reducing data overload through careful data display. Content analysis involves reading and judgment. Set out Brenner study 1985 set out several steps in undertaking a content analysis of open-ended data. It begins with briefing, understanding the problem and its context in detail, sampling of people, including the types of sample sought, associating with other work that has been done, hypothesis development, hypothesis testing, immersion in the data collected to pick up all the clues, categorizing, in which the categories and their labels must reflect the purpose of the research, be exhaustive and be mutually exclusive. Incubation, for example, reflecting on data and developing interpretations and meanings. Synthesis, involving a review of the rationale for coding and an identification of the emerging patterns and themes. Culling, condensing, excising, and even reinterpreting the data so that they can be written up intelligibly. An interpretation, making meaning of the data, and then writing, including giving clear guidance on the incidence of occurrence, proving an indication of direction and intentionality of feelings, being aware of what is not said as well as what is said, silences, indicating salience, and rethinking. Content analysis requires researchers to address several factors: understand the research brief thoroughly, evaluate the relevance of the sample for the research project, associate their own experiences with the problem, looking for clues from the past, develop testable hypotheses as the basis for the content analysis, test the hypothesis throughout the interviewing and analysis process, stay immersed in the data throughout the study, categorize the data in the concept book, creating labels and codes, incubate the data before writing up, synthesize the data in the concept book and looking for key concepts. Cull the data. Being selective is important because it is impossible to report everything that happened. Interpret the data, identifying its meaning and implication, and write up the report. Rethink and rewrite. Have the research objectives been met? If yes, your thesis is complete. Hickner sets out procedures that can be followed when phenomenologically analyzing interview data. Phenomenologist advocates the study of direct experience taken at face value and sees behavior as determined by the phenomena of experience rather than by external, objective, and physically described reality. He points out that there is a reluctance on the part of phenomenologists to focus too much on specific steps in research methods for fear that they will become reified. The steps suggested by him, however, offer a possible way of analyzing data which allays such fears. As he himself explains, his guidelines have arisen out of a number of years of teaching phenomenological research classes to graduate psychology students and trying to be true to the phenomena of interview data while also providing concrete guidelines. In summary, the guidelines are as follows. Transcription. Having the interview tape transcribed, noting not only the literal statements but also non-verbal and paralinguistic communication. Bracketing and phenomenological reduction. This means suspending as much as possible the researcher's meaning and interpretations and entering into the world of the unique individual who was interviewed. The researcher thus sets out to understand what the interviewee is saying rather than what the researcher expects that person to say. Listening to the interview for a sense of the whole. This involves listening to the entire tape several times and reading the transcript a number of times in order to provide a context for the emergence of specific units of meaning and themes later on. Delineating units of general meaning. This entails a thorough scrutiny of both verbal and non-verbal gestures to elicit the participants' meaning. Delineating units of meaning relevant to the research question. Once the units of general meaning have been noted, they are then reduced to units of meaning relevant to the research question. Training independent judges to verify the units of relevant meaning. Findings can be verified by using other researchers to carry out the above procedures. His own experience in working with graduate students well trained in this type of research is that there are really significant differences in the findings. Eliminating redundancies. At this stage, the researcher checks the list of relevant meaning and eliminates those clearly redundant to others previously listed. Clustering units of relevant meaning. The researcher now tries to determine if any of the units of relevant meaning naturally cluster together. Determining themes from clusters of meaning. The researcher examines all the clusters of meaning to determine if there is one which expresses the essence of these clusters. Writing a summary of each individual interview. It is useful at this point to go back to the interview transcription and write up a summary of the interview incorporating the themes that have been elicited from the data. Return to the participants with the summary and themes. Conducting a second interview. This is a check to see whether the essence of the first interview has been accurately and fully captured. Modifying themes and summary. With the new data from the second interview, the researcher looks at all the data as a whole and modifies them or adds themes as necessary. Identifying general and unique themes for all the interviews. The researcher now looks for the themes common to most or all of the interviews as well as the individual variations. The first step is to note if there are themes common to all or most of the interviews. The second step is to note when there are themes that are unique to a single interview or a minority of the interviews. Contextualization of themes. At this point, it is useful to place these themes back within the overall context or horizons from which they emerged. And composite summary. It is useful to write up a composite summary of all the interviews which would accurately capture the essence of the phenomena being investigated. Such a composite summary describes the world in general as experienced by the participants. So, what are the methodological tools for analyzing qualitative data? There are several procedural tools for analyzing qualitative data. Lecomte and Presley see analytic, induction, constant, comparison, typological analysis, and enumeration as valuable techniques for the qualitative researcher to use in analyzing data and generating theory. Analytic induction is a term and process that was introduced by Nenitsky in deliberate opposition to statistical methods of data analysis. Lecomte and Presley suggest that the process is akin to the several steps set out above, in that data are scanned to generate categories of phenomena, relationships between these categories are sought, and working typologies and summaries are written on the basis of the data examined. These are then refined by subsequent cases and analysis. Negative and discrepant cases are deliberately sought to modify, enlarge, or restrict the original explanation. A rough definition of the phenomena to be explained is formulated. A hypothetical explanation of that phenomena is formulated. One case is studied in the light of the hypothesis with the object of determining whether or not the hypothesis fits the facts in that case. If the hypothesis does not fit the facts, either the hypothesis is reformulated or the phenomena to be explained is redefined so that the case is excluded. Practical certainty may be attained after a small number of cases has been examined, but the discovery of negative cases disproves the explanation and requires a reformulation. This procedure of examining cases, redefining the phenomena, and reformulating the hypothesis is continued until a universal relationship is established, each negative case calling for a redefinition of a reformulation. A more deliberate seeking of disconfirming cases is advocated by Bogdan and Bicklin, where they enumerate 5 main elements in analytic induction. In the early stages of the research, a rough definition and explanation of the particular phenomena is developed. This definition and explanation is examined in light of the data that are being collected during the research. If the definition and explanation or both have been generated, need modification in light of new data, then this is undertaken. A deliberate attempt is made to find cases that may not fit in the explanation or definition. The process of redefinition and reformulation is repeated until the explanation is reached that embraces all the data, and until a generalized relationship has been established which will also embrace the negative cases. Then constant comparison. In constant comparison, the researcher compares newly acquired data with existing data and categories and theories that have been devised and which are emerging in order to achieve a perfect fit between these and the data. Typological analysis. Typological analysis is essentially a classificatory process wherein data are put into groups, subsets, or categories on the basis of some clear criterion: acts, behavior, meanings, nature of participation, relationships, settings, activities. It is the process of secondary coding where descriptive codes are then drawn together and put into subsets. Typologies are a set of phenomena that represent subtypes of a more general set or category. In creating typologies, Laughlin, 1970, insists that the researcher must deliberately assemble all the data on how a participant addresses a particular issue. What strategies are being employed? Disaggregate and separate out the variations between the ranges of instances of strategies. Classify these into sets and subsets and present them in an ordered, named, and numbered way for the reader. And finally, in enumeration. The process of enumeration is one in which categories and the frequencies of codes, units of analysis, terms, words, or ideas are counted. This enables incidents to be recorded and indeed statistical analysis of the frequencies to be undertaken. This is a method used in conventional forms of content analysis. So this lecture has suggested several approaches to analyzing and presenting qualitative data. This should be taken as an initial step because it is not full. There are so many other ways, and some of them we'll discuss when we'll discuss content analysis. So some of the qualitative data analysis which is complementary to this lecture will be discussed in a later lecture. That's all for today, and thank you very much for listening. Until the next lecture, goodbye.